It is Friday, August 30th, 2019, and we now have major Hurricane Dorian. As of the 2 o'clock advisory from the National Hurricane Center, it has been upgraded to a Category 3 major hurricane. Satellite imagery, your eye is drawn to that feature right in the middle, and that is Dorian, showing some big-time intensity changes over the last 24 hours. 115-mile-per-hour sustained winds with those gusts up and over 130 miles per hour. Its central pressure has been slowly dropping, too. We're down to 970 millibars, and something we're going to have to watch really closely is that forward movement. It's now down to 10 miles per hour, a relatively slow-moving system. And you saw there in the last couple images, we are now seeing an eye warming and clearing out. In terms of the SAFFIR-SIMPSON scale, we just approached that Category 3 status, 111 to 129, and there is some indications that it will strengthen further. In fact, a lot of indications that it will strengthen further upwards to a Category 4 storm. In fact, National Hurricane Center's track has it up to 140-mile-per-hour winds, so medium range, Category 4 storm. In terms of our distances today, we're about 600 miles off to the east-southeast of Miami. Still a long ways to go, and with that forward movement of only 10 miles per hour, it's going to take its time getting there. The overall size of the storm has been slowly expanding. As it gains latitude, we expect that storm size to kind of stretch on out, as well as the wind field that we're going to talk about in more detail in just a minute or so. Now that eye that has cleared on out, it's about a 14-mile diameter eye, so certainly clearing on out. And you notice the white shading here and the shades of black as well. We're looking at the infrared satellite imagery that tells us the temperature of the cloud tops. When we have colors like this, that tells us those cloud tops are extremely cold, meaning the thunderstorms are very healthy and very high up in the sky, which is why they're so cold, especially the southern portion there really showing a blow up of some thunderstorm activity. Now let's talk about the wind field here, and this is kind of a little bit interesting. A hurricane is broken down into 4 quadrants, and each quadrant is not created equal. It has to do with its forward motion. In this case, Dorian is moving off to the northwest at 10 miles per hour. We're always going to find the strongest winds in the northeast quadrant relative to the storm motion. Right now, we're also finding the largest wind field there. We're seeing tropical storm force winds as of the latest Hurricane Hunter aircraft advisory coming out at 11 a.m. Those tropical storm force winds of 39 miles per hour or greater extend out from the center 90 miles per hour in the northeast quadrant. But notice as you get to the southwest quadrant, all those winds only get out to around 40 miles. That's because we have to factor in that forward motion of 10 miles per hour. You're also going to find the highest gusts in this area, too, as it moves off to the north and west there, in the lowest or the smallest wind field down to the southwest. That also has to do with hurricane force winds. We're finding those only extending out 20 miles in the northeast quadrant relative to the storm motion there. Overall, a very small wind field so far in terms of where you'll run into those 74-mile-per-hour winds or greater sustained winds. Of course, we have higher gusts. You saw in the advisory, those gusts getting up to 130 miles per hour in the northeast quadrant most likely. So that's how you break down the hurricane there into those quadrants. Here's how it looks on that infrared imagery again over the last 12 hours, certainly showing some signs of strengthening. I mean, the biggest sign is that clearing or that warming and clearing of the eye there. In fact, we're going to watch for something to occur here in the coming days, something called an eye wall replacement cycle. What happens is the inner eye wall kind of collapses in on itself and then is replaced by the outer eye wall. And when that occurs, it leads to a brief weakening of the overall system, but then it spreads out the wind field and actually makes the storm a little bit larger, and it comes back a little bit stronger. So that's a sign of strengthening, too, and that normally occurs in these very intense hurricanes. And you can watch the wind field kind of expand here as it gains latitude and as it goes through those eye wall replacement cycles. The yellow shaded circle here is tropical storm force winds, certainly expanding out in a larger area as it heads towards the northern Bahamas. That little red circle in between there is hurricane force winds, and the orange is around 60-mile-per-hour winds ranging out from there. So the bigger picture, again, it is organizing and organizing fast. It's likely going to undergo a period of rapid intensification. And the definition of that is when it increases its overall sustained winds by about 30 knots in 24 hours. And we're likely going to see this here in the next 24 hours or so. In the last couple images there of the satellite imagery, you can see there's kind of almost like a little bit of some squeezing southwards here, right? That's starting to show us that it's starting to encounter the high pressure area, the ridging that's building over the Atlantic, and that's going to be a key player here in steering Dorian in its future path towards the east coast. And there even are some indications that's going to throw that whole track possibly off kilter from where it currently is. I'm going to show you that in 1 second. Visible satellite imagery, always my favorite to look at when the sun is up, obviously. We can see the beautiful kind of symmetry here shaping up of this hurricane. The eye wall clearing on out. We have the outflow boundaries here, and then we also have outflow boundaries. We have the feathering of the cirrus clouds as the outflow. The inflow coming in from the south and looping on in with that moist air building back into the south there. I mean, just beautiful. And there's that high-res imagery here. You can kind of see the mesovortices within this eye center here and the very intense thunderstorm activity building all around it. In fact, it's completely encircled now. It's almost walling itself off from any inhibiting factors. As we look forward for that track, well, there's been ideal conditions for the last day or so, and that's expected to continue. Low wind shear, 5 to 10 knots at most, maybe some slightly higher areas close to the coastline. Even that's not likely to disrupt a very intense hurricane of that size and that nature. Also, the water temperature's been very, very warm. This time of year running about a degree above where we should be for this time of the year, mid, upper 80s. Also, on top of that, that warm water, that's just the skin of the surface. It actually extends down to pretty good depth. When a hurricane moves over the water, it mixes things up, right? Very heavy surf. And a lot of times the upwelling, which is what that's called, mixes up colder water from the depths to the surface and essentially is self-limiting. It starts to kind of lose its energy source. When you have the heated water or the warm waters extending down, the upwelling is just going to keep replacing the warm water aloft or at the surface with warm water below it too. So just kind of keeps feeding the storm. Moist environment out there, too. We're not seeing nearly as much of that rust and yellow color into the environment it's moving into now, so that's very moist. The relative humidity has only been increasing for the last 12 hours and is expected to do so further. Watches and warnings, we do have some up for the Northern Bahamas. They are next in line here to deal with the brunt of Dorian in the next 24 to 36 hours. That hurricane watch will likely be upgraded to a hurricane warning, probably by tonight or even into early tomorrow. Here is the latest track from the National Hurricane Center. This is off the 11 o'clock advisory. We are now in 3-hour updates because it is bearing down to the Northern Bahamas, so there is an imminent threat to land. So our next update is going to come out at 5 o'clock. That'll be a track update or a forecast update, and then again at 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock tonight. No real big changes in the short term, at least. Notice the forward movement here from Saturday at 8 a.m. to Sunday at 8 a.m. covers a good amount of ground. But then after that, we start to see a considerable slowdown in its forward speed as it moves through the Northern Bahamas, and that is going to lead to some big uncertainties here in the far end of the forecast period with that turn north and exactly where that occurs, along with the very slow movement to the north. It's going to be stuck in a very weak steering environment, too. Here's the players at large. We just showed you that ridge of high pressure that was sitting over the Atlantic. That's already starting to affect the outflow to the north of the storm, right? So that's going to help push it off towards the west-northwest. It's eventually going to have more westerly than northwesterly in the coming hours. But there's going to be a weakness in this ridge. There's a ridge over the Atlantic, another one over the middle parts of the country, in between a trough. And that presents a scenario that it could escape off to the north or lift the storm northwards. And there are some indications. I was just discussing some of these computer models with my chief that this actually turns it northwards a little bit sooner, potentially even before making landfall on the east coast of Florida. It's a possibility that we could see that play out. We have to see if it's the start of a trend or not. However, if this ridge is a little bit stronger, a little bit farther off towards the west, it could delay that turn north a little while longer after making landfall and moving right up along the I-95 corridor up into Georgia and eventually into South Carolina. So exactly where that northward turn occurs is going to be monumental into the impacts here. Here's how the computer models are seeing things. Notice some of them are turning it just offshore here. That would present a scenario like we saw back in 2016 with Matthew, when it pretty much didn't even make landfall. It just moved entirely along the east coast of Florida and then moved northward. Some still have it back inland moving north, but we're going to see if that's a trend pushing it farther to the east. Worth noting here, there have been 0 major hurricanes that have made landfall along Florida's Atlantic coast north of Francis. This is the track for Francis back in 2004. Those records go all the way back to 1851. 2004 was a very bad year for this part of Florida because a week later after Francis, Jeanne came in nearly the exact same area as a major hurricane. And since then, there has been 0 major hurricanes along the entire east coast of Florida, but never north of here. And all of those records going back to 1851. So interesting to look at climatology here. Sometimes you have to throw it out the window, like we saw back with Florence. We were looking at it out in the Atlantic, and we said, oh, and it can never come towards the East Coast in this position in the Atlantic, and it did. Records only go back to 1851. Certainly could have happened before that. Here's how the two global models see things, GFS and the European. Remarkable consistency here over the past couple days. It continues to be that way. Notice both showing very intense storms here, or Dorian, moving through the northern parts of the Bahamas. Almost their centers exactly in the same spot as we get on through Sunday at 11 a.m. Notice that the timing here also. Really take note of that. 4 o'clock in the morning on Monday, we are still well offshore. The timing's continuing to be pushed back. A slower system here, slower forward motion. 4 a.m. in the morning, and then we get towards Tuesday morning, Tuesday evening. Starts to slide up the coastline there, and potential plays out. The latest run of the Euro and the GFS pretty much straddling the southeast coastline, and that's not good. That's not good. Although the winds at least will be a little bit weaker on that side. The western side of the storm is usually a little bit weaker storm, a little bit weaker storm winds. On the east side, that's usually the dirty side of the storm. We see the strongest wind gusts there. That's what I was trying to get out. So here's a look at a breakdown, probably time to do that, of the threats that could be growing as this nears the east coast of Florida. First, the arrival of the probability of hurricane-force winds. Near certainty here through the northern end of the Bahamas. But as we get towards the east coast of Florida, those chances drop to around 60–70%. Of course, they will increase as the storm gets closer, but this is just the odds right now. Let's talk about storm surge, because if that does make landfall on Florida's east coast, we are going to be talking about some pretty intense storm surge levels. And the reason why that occurs is because the wind coming onshore, blowing consistently, piles up that water along the coastline and eventually moves it inland, sometimes rising 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 feet in some instances in some locations. This is not the forecast for Florida, but it's the possibility that that occurs in storm surge scenarios. On top of that, what's really going to kind of add salt to the wound is a king tide. That's occurring this weekend. There is a new moon. There's a new moon happening tonight. And that's going to bring along astronomically higher tides than you'd find normally. So Dorian will actually amplify the effects. We're already seeing tidal flooding along the entire southeast coastline. With a hurricane getting closer, that's only going to be amplified there. Rainfall, once it moves onshore, close to shore, we're going to see ample amounts of freshwater flooding. Some of these models will start with the GFS here, put us up close to 20 inches of rain along the immediate coastline. The European pretty much right on target with that too, really right along the immediate coastline from Florida up to Georgia and South Carolina too. So we could be talking about a lot of rain, and if it does slow down, we could be seeing a lot more. And if that's not enough to talk about, guess what's brewing way out in the Atlantic, just emerging off the coast of Africa? Another tropical wave here that right now within the next 5 days, low odds, but there are odds, 30% chance of that developing. Next name on the list is Fernand. All right, that's the latest update for today. We're going to have another one later on this evening with our chief, and probably multiple times throughout the day tomorrow and the entire weekend to keep you ahead of the storm. You can always find me on social media, Facebook, meteorologist Tim Pandages, or on Twitter at 13 Tim Pandages.